Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Sherlock Holmes and the Shadow of Blackmoor, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from, share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. The Mysterious Visitor at Baker Street. It was a dreary, fog-choked morning in London, when the door to our modest flat on Baker Street opened with a creak. I had barely finished my breakfast of toast and tea when I heard a muffled knock and the unmistakable shuffle of hurried footsteps approaching the stairs. My friend Sherlock Holmes did not flinch from his perch by the fireplace, his ever-present violin case beside him. He was deep in thought, as usual, but I sensed the weight of something coming, something unusual. He could always feel it before I could. The door swung open, and there stood a man who appeared no older than 30, his clothes soaked through from the persistent drizzle that clung to every surface of the city. He was a gaunt figure, pale beneath the mud-smeared brim of his hat. His eyes, however, spoke of distress, wide and haunted, the kind of gaze that no ordinary man could wear without some deep personal anguish. He removed his hat slowly, and with an almost imperceptible shudder, he stepped inside, shutting the door behind him with a quiet but deliberate motion. "Good morning," I greeted, setting my tea aside and rising from my chair as I knew Holmes would not speak first. "You appear to have been caught in the rain. Please sit. We can attend to your troubles." His voice came hoarse, barely above a whisper. "I have heard of your detective skills, Dr. Watson, Mr. Holmes. I need your help, urgently. It concerns Blackmoor Manor." Holmes did not look up from his violin as the name was uttered, but his hand paused, and I could see his brow furrow slightly. Blackmoor Manor was a place known to us only in passing, an old family estate located some 50 miles outside of London. A place whispered about, mentioned in vague terms, and always with a sense of unease. The name seemed out of place on this particular morning, almost as though it had conjured the fog itself. "Blackmoor Manor," Holmes repeated softly, placing his violin aside. "Continue." The visitor took a deep breath, steadying himself, as though forcing the words from some dark, well-guarded part of his mind. "My name is Edward Phelps. I am the last surviving member of the Phelps family. The estate, my family. We have lived at Blackmoor for generations, but for the past decade we have been plagued by a shadow, a curse, if you will. Several months ago, my uncle, Richard Phelps, died there under mysterious circumstances, and now I fear it has come for me." I was taken aback. "A curse?" I inquired, though I could hardly keep the skepticism from my voice. The notion of curses had long since been dismissed from our realm of inquiry. Yet something in Phelps's tone made me pause. He was clearly not one to speak of such matters lightly. "I don't believe in curses either, Dr. Watson," Phelps said, his voice growing steadier. "But the events surrounding my uncle's death were beyond explanation. And now I've received a letter from beyond the grave. A letter warning me that that it is coming for me." Holmes leaned forward, his piercing eyes finally meeting Phelps's gaze. "A letter, you say? And what did it contain?" Phelps pulled a crumpled, dark envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to Holmes. The letter was simply addressed to Edward Phelps, Blackmoor Manor. Holmes took the letter with a quiet nod and unfolded it, his eyes scanning its contents. It was brief, a single sentence in a neat, angular hand. The shadow that claimed Richard will claim you next. The manor will not rest until its hunger is sated. Holmes's expression was unreadable, but his lips curled in a thin line. I see. And what exactly do you mean by the shadow? Phelps trembled slightly at the question, but he regained his composure before answering. It is a presence, Mr. Holmes, a dark figure that haunts the manor. It's been there for years, always in the periphery of sight, and it grows stronger with each passing year. My uncle spoke of it on his deathbed, his voice shaking. I thought he was delusional from his illness, but now I fear he was not. I glanced at Holmes, whose lips were pressed into a tight line. Have others seen this shadow? Yes. Phelps nodded, his hands clenching into fists. Several servants, the groundskeeper, even the cook. All have seen it, but no one speaks of it openly. When it's mentioned, people are dismissed or dismiss themselves. They leave, or worse, they vanish. I could sense the fear in his voice, and as he spoke, a chill settled over the room. It was not the kind of case Holmes usually took, supernatural or otherwise, but the raw terror that emanated from Phelps seemed to promise there was something more than a mere ghost story here. Perhaps you could shed light on the matter, Mr. Holmes, Phelps continued, his eyes pleading. I am to return to Blackmoor this evening, but I do not know what to expect, and I fear I may meet the same fate as my uncle. Holmes studied the letter for a long moment, the faint flicker of a smile crossing his face. Your fear is palpable, Mr. Phelps, and your desire for help equally so. But let us be clear, my dear Watson, there is no such thing as a shadow that haunts a place. It is a matter of logic and observation, not the supernatural. Phelps looked relieved at Holmes's words, but still uneasy. So, you will help me? Holmes stood abruptly, as if a decision had been made. Of course, Mr. Phelps. We will accompany you to Blackmoor Manor, but I must warn you, this will be no simple task. Your shadow is most certainly something more tangible than you have imagined. I caught the slight twinkle in Holmes's eye as he grabbed his coat, already thinking several steps ahead. As I followed suit, a sense of foreboding filled my chest. The day was grim, the fog hanging heavy on the city, and I wondered what awaited us in that dark, distant manor, whether it was the work of a disturbed mind or something far more sinister. Together we left our flat and entered the fog-choked streets of London, the clatter of carriage wheels and the murmur of the Thames faint in the distance. Our journey had begun, and with it, the shadow of Blackmoor Manor loomed ever larger in our minds. Chapter 2. The Letter from Beyond the Grave. It was an overcast morning when the letter arrived. The fog that clung to the streets of London seemed thicker than usual, as though it too were aware of the dark event it would soon herald. The rhythmic clip-clop of a horse-drawn carriage echoed down Baker Street as I sat at my desk, making a feeble attempt at organizing my notes from the previous day's case. Holmes, as ever, was deeply immersed in his work, a tangle of chemistry, experiments surrounding him. The doorbell rang sharply, cutting through the quiet morning air, and I glanced up, my curiosity piqued. Mrs. Hudson, our ever-efficient landlady, appeared in the doorway, holding an envelope in her hand. For you, Mr. Holmes, she said, her voice tinged with an odd hesitation. It came just now, special delivery, but the man seemed to be in quite a rush. Holmes, who had been leaning over a magnifying glass, set it down, and took the envelope with a quiet nod. There was nothing unusual about its appearance at first glance, just the typical thick, yellowed paper used for official correspondence. But it was the seal that caught his attention, a wax impression bearing an unfamiliar crest, one that Holmes studied intently for a moment before turning it over to reveal the address. "From Blackmoor Manor," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "That is curious indeed." I had not anticipated hearing from them again. He broke the seal with a swift motion, and as he unfolded the letter, the expression on his face shifted from mild interest to something more grave. The letter was short, but its contents were unmistakably chilling. It read as follows: "To Sherlock Holmes, should this letter reach you, I will already be dead. I write to warn you of a death that will soon follow mine. The shadow that has haunted Blackmoor for years has now claimed me. It will come for another. I beg you to act before it is too late." The letter was signed simply R.P. Holmes remained silent for a long while, his eyes scanning the words once again. I could see the tension in his posture, the slight furrowing of his brow that indicated he was already deep in thought. I, too, felt a shiver run through me. Blackmoor Manor was not a place one simply forgot. It had a reputation, rumors of its bleak history, the strange occurrences surrounding it, and the whispered tales of the shadow that haunted its halls. I had never believed in such things, but Holmes's reaction made me pause. "Who is this R.P.?" I asked, my voice laced with unease. "A resident of Blackmoor?" Holmes nodded absently. "Richard Phelps, Watson. He was the last of the Phelps family, a distant relative of our client, Edward Phelps, the man we met yesterday. Richard's death was deemed an accident, but I now wonder if there was more to it." "More to it? Do you think his death was murder?" Holmes looked up sharply, his gaze steady. "I do, Watson. This letter is not the product of a mind gripped by fever or madness. It is a calculated warning, written by a man who knew his end was near. Richard Phelps was not simply a victim of the shadows. He was a victim of something far more tangible." I sat back, absorbing Holmes's words. The letter from beyond the grave had added yet another layer to the mystery surrounding Blackmoor Manor. It was one thing to suspect foul play, but this cryptic message suggested that Richard Phelps had known exactly what was coming, and that he had intended to leave us a clue. But what did it all mean? "Holmes, we must go to Blackmoor," I said, the urgency of the situation now clear to me. "This shadow, whatever it is, may yet claim another life." Holmes stood, his movements swift and decisive, a sign that the game was afoot. "Indeed, Watson, we shall go at once. But there is more at play here than a mere supernatural occurrence. The Phelps family has been steeped in mystery for generations, and I suspect that the truth lies not in ghostly apparitions, but in a more earthly cause." We gathered our coats and hats, the heavy weight of the fog outside serving as a grim reminder of what lay ahead. As we stepped into the carriage and made our way toward the distant manor, I found myself once again wondering about the shadow that haunted its walls. Was it simply the creation of an overstressed mind, or was there something far darker lurking within Blackmoor Manor? The journey was long, the roads muddied by the endless rain, and the further we drove, the more the landscape seemed to change. The bustling streets of London gave way to barren fields, and the towering buildings shrank into the distance. By the time we arrived at Blackmoor Manor, the light was dim, the thick fog making it seem as though the house itself was barely visible against the shifting darkness. The manor loomed before us, a great crumbling edifice that seemed to swallow the light. It was an imposing building, with high, wrought-iron gates that creaked eerily in the wind. As we stepped out of the carriage, the scent of damp earth and decaying wood filled the air. The place felt heavy, burdened by years of secrets and untold stories. A tall figure greeted us at the door, Edward Phelps, our client, who looked even more weary than he had the day before. His face was drawn, and his eyes carried the unmistakable weight of fear. "Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice a low murmur, "I didn't think you would come. The letter—" Holmes raised a hand, cutting him off. "I received your uncle's message, Mr. Phelps, and we are here to uncover the truth behind it. Show us where your uncle passed away." Without a word, Phelps led us through the cold, dark halls of the manor. As we passed through the grand entrance and into the drawing room, a chill seemed to hang in the air. The heavy curtains were drawn, blocking out what little light there was. It was as though the house itself had been designed to shut out the outside world. The atmosphere was oppressive, and the distant echoes of the manor's history seemed to reverberate in the silence. We reached a small study where Richard Phelps had spent his final hours. The room was cluttered, papers strewn about haphazardly, as though someone had been searching for something in a panic. It was clear that something had been amiss in the final days of his life. Holmes began to examine the room carefully, his sharp eyes scanning every detail. He knelt by the desk and picked up a small, faded envelope that had been pushed aside. As he opened it, I could see a similar wax seal to the one on the letter we had received earlier. Inside was another note, written in a hurried hand. "Strange," Holmes muttered, scanning the letter. "It seems Richard Phelps was trying to convey something before his death. He was not merely afraid of some ethereal presence. He knew exactly what he was facing." I watched as Holmes meticulously pieced together the fragments of evidence before him. The letter, the hastily scribbled note, the state of the room, everything seemed to lead to one conclusion. The death of Richard Phelps was no accident. Someone or something had driven him to his end, and now that same force was turning its attention to Edward. "We are not dealing with the supernatural here, Watson," Holmes said, looking up at me with his ever-present intensity. "There is a much darker force at play within these walls." As I looked around the dimly lit room, I could not shake the feeling that Holmes was right. Blackmoor Manor was no ordinary house. It was a place of hidden motives, where family secrets festered, and the truth seemed more elusive than ever. The mystery had only deepened, and as the fog closed in around us, I could not help but wonder if we were walking into a trap that would prove far more dangerous than we had anticipated. Chapter 3. The Journey to Blackmoor. The morning had passed with an unsettling quiet that seemed to hang in the air, as though the city of London itself was holding its breath. Holmes, for his part, was restless, his mind clearly occupied with thoughts of the strange letter we had received the previous day. I, too, found my thoughts lingering on the mysterious message and the shadow that seemed to hover over Blackmoor Manor. It was not merely a case of foul play that intrigued Holmes. No, there was something deeper at work here, something that had yet to reveal itself in full. Our journey to Blackmoor was not a quick one. The fog had rolled in from the Thames, thick and cloying, swallowing the city in its cold embrace. The familiar, gaslit streets of London gradually gave way to the more barren roads leading out of the city, and I felt a growing sense of unease as we left the noise and bustle behind us. The carriage ride itself was uncomfortable, the wheels clattering against the uneven cobblestones, the horse's breath fogging the air. I looked out of the window, but all I could see was the grey blur of the mist, swirling and shifting like a living thing. As we ventured further from the city, the world outside seemed to grow darker and more oppressive. The once vibrant countryside now appeared desolate, with only sparse, skeletal trees lining the roads and long stretches of muddy fields that seemed to go on forever. The sky above us was a dull, overcast grey, and a steady drizzle had begun to fall, further adding to the gloom that settled over everything. Even Holmes, typically impervious to such distractions, seemed perturbed by the air of desolation that clung to the landscape. At one point, the driver turned the horses down a narrow, winding path that led deeper into the countryside, the trees growing thicker on either side. The road had become more of a track, muddy and uneven, and I felt the carriage sway as it made its way along the path. I glanced at Holmes, who was staring out of the window, his sharp eyes scanning the landscape with the intensity of a hawk. He seemed to be absorbed in his thoughts, though I could sense a flicker of something else behind his composed exterior. An anticipation, perhaps, or an understanding that we were heading towards something that neither of us fully comprehended yet. After what seemed an eternity, the mist parted briefly, revealing the outline of Blackmoor Manor in the distance. It rose like a shadow from the earth, an imposing structure set against the darkened sky. The manor was old, much older than most of the estates in this part of the country, and its appearance matched the stories I had heard about it. A place shrouded in mystery, a place where the past clung to the present like a rotting vine. Its stone walls, grey and weathered, seemed to sag under the weight of time, and the tall, arched windows looked out over the grounds with a sense of cold indifference. It was a house that felt alive with secrets, and I had no doubt that what awaited us inside would be anything but pleasant. As the carriage drew closer, the wind seemed to pick up, howling through the trees and rattling the branches. A shiver ran down my spine, though I quickly dismissed it as the cold. It wasn't just the weather that unsettled me. It was the looming presence of the manor, its silence, its sheer isolation. There was something about the place that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end, and I could see that Holmes, too, was deeply aware of the atmosphere surrounding us. The carriage came to a stop in front of the grand entrance, and the door opened almost immediately, revealing Edward Phelps, our client from the day before. He looked more fatigued than I had remembered, his face pale and drawn, his eyes red from what I assumed to be lack of sleep. He stepped forward quickly, as if eager to leave the confines of the carriage, and he motioned for us to follow him inside. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," he said, his voice tinged with a mixture of relief and dread. "I wasn't sure you would, but I'm glad you have." Holmes offered a curt nod and stepped down from the carriage, followed by myself. I noticed that Phelps hesitated slightly as we made our way toward the entrance. His eyes flicked nervously toward the shadows that seemed to gather around the manor, as though some invisible presence were watching us. "We'll get to the matter at hand shortly, Mr. Phelps," Holmes said, his voice calm but firm. "But tell me, how long has it been since you've seen anything unusual here? Since your uncle's death, I mean." Phelps's expression darkened at the mention of his uncle. He swallowed, his throat tight with emotion, before answering, "It's been about 2 months now, and the strange occurrences started almost immediately after my uncle's passing. I don't know what to make of it. Some of the staff have left, unable to endure the atmosphere here. The rest are too afraid to speak openly about it." I've told no one, but I believe there is something in this house that's not right. Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. We will find the truth, Mr. Phelps, but first, allow me to examine the scene of your uncle's death. Phelps led us through the grand entrance and into the dimly lit interior of Blackmoor Manor. The house was eerily silent, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath our feet, the only sound that broke the stillness. As we walked through the hallways, I couldn't help but feel as though we were being watched. The gas lamps cast long shadows on the walls, distorting the shapes of the portraits and antique furniture, giving the entire house a ghostly, spectral quality. We eventually reached the room where Richard Phelps had passed away. It was a small study, its windows covered with heavy drapes, allowing only a small amount of light to filter through. The room was cramped, filled with bookshelves that lined the walls, and a large oak desk sat against the far wall, papers scattered across its surface as though in haste. There was an unmistakable air of neglect, of something left unfinished, lingering like a stain in the room. Holmes immediately began to examine the scene with his characteristic attention to detail. He moved around the room with precision, his eyes scanning every corner, every object. I stood by the door, observing him closely, my mind racing with questions. What had happened to Richard Phelps? And what was it that had driven the man to write such a cryptic letter before his death? As I watched Holmes, I felt a growing sense of unease. The house, the case, it was all far darker than I had initially realized. Finally, Holmes turned to me, his face inscrutable. "Watson," he said quietly, "there is something here, something beyond our understanding. But we must proceed with caution. We are not dealing with mere superstition, nor are we facing a simple case of murder. There are forces at work here that we cannot yet see." I felt a chill run through me as I looked around the room once more. The shadows seemed to grow longer, the air heavier. Whatever lay ahead, I knew one thing for certain. This case would not be easily solved, and the truth, when we found it, would likely be far more terrifying than we could ever have imagined. Chapter 4. The Victim's Last Words. It was with a heavy heart that I followed Holmes through the grand, dimly lit hallways of Blackmoor Manor. The oppressive silence within these walls seemed to press in on me from all sides, making my every step feel like an intrusion into a place that had long since lost its connection to the world beyond. The weight of our purpose here was clear. This was no ordinary investigation. There was something ancient, something deeply unsettling about Blackmoor, and I could not escape the feeling that it was far more than just a haunted house. Holmes, of course, showed no signs of discomfort. His mind, always sharp and focused, was already deep in the process of unraveling the threads of this mystery. With every step, his eyes darted about, taking in every detail, no matter how seemingly insignificant. He had already begun to form his conclusions, I was certain, but he did not share them with me. That was the way of Sherlock Holmes. His mind worked in silence, his deductions always a step ahead. We arrived at the small study where Richard Phelps had been found, and Holmes immediately set to work. I observed him closely as he examined the scene with his usual precision. His eyes scanned the room, moving from the overturned chair to the scattered papers on the desk. A large fireplace loomed at one end of the room, its hearth cold and unused, while the faint scent of dampness hung in the air. There was a chill in the room, though it was not the physical cold that unsettled me, but the strange, lingering presence of something that could not be explained away by logic alone. The body had been removed, of course, but the evidence of Richard Phelps's death remained. A small puddle of dried blood stained the floor where he had fallen, and the room was littered with items that appeared to have been disturbed in a frantic search. But it was not the blood or the disarray that drew Holmes's attention. No, it was something far more subtle. He knelt by the desk, inspecting a small leather-bound journal that had been left half open. His fingers brushed over the worn cover as though he could feel the weight of the victim's last thoughts. Carefully, he flipped the pages, his eyes scanning the ink-stained words with practiced ease. For several moments, there was no sound but the faint rustle of paper and the soft ticking of a clock from the corner of the room. Then, without looking up, Holmes spoke in a low, measured voice. "Watson, come here. You must see this." I stepped forward, my heart quickening as I leaned over his shoulder to examine the pages of the journal. The handwriting was erratic, rushed, as though the writer had been pressed for time, aware that his moments were numbered. The words were a jumble of confusion, filled with dread and panic, but one phrase stood out above the rest. "The shadow is here. It has come for me. I am its next victim. The curse will not be denied." I felt a cold shiver run through me as I read the words. They were filled with an unmistakable sense of finality, as if Richard Phelps had known that death was inevitable, that no escape remained. And yet there was more to this than simple fear. The phrase "the curse" jumped out at me, and I could not shake the feeling that it was not a mere metaphor, but something more, a real, tangible force that had taken hold of the Phelps family for generations. Holmes did not share my unease. He continued to read, his brow furrowed in concentration, his lips moving silently as he absorbed the words. After a few moments, he closed the journal with a soft snap and placed it carefully back on the desk. It appears that our late friend was a man who understood that he was not merely the victim of an unfortunate accident, but a man ensnared by something far older than he could comprehend. I could not help but feel a pang of sympathy for Richard Phelps. His death, though violent, had been preceded by a growing sense of inevitable doom. And now, through his journal, we were privy to his final, terrified thoughts. But it was the mention of the curse that caught my attention. Was this simply the ravings of a man at the end of his life? Or was there truly something more to the legend of Blackmoor Manor? Holmes turned to me, his expression thoughtful but unwavering. "It is clear that Phelps believed in this curse. But why, Watson? What is the origin of this belief? And why now, after so many years of the family living here, has it taken its toll on them? We must understand the history of this place before we can make sense of the present." I nodded, my mind already racing through the possible answers. There were few records left of the manor's past, but what we had gathered so far suggested that Blackmoor Manor had been steeped in mystery for generations. The stories of strange occurrences and untimely deaths were whispered about, but no one had ever dared to speak of them openly, at least not in any way that would explain the recent events. As Holmes continued his examination of the room, I turned my attention back to the body's final resting place. It was then that I noticed something else, something that had gone unnoticed until now. A small symbol had been etched into the wooden floorboards near the desk, as though it had been carved hastily with a sharp object. I knelt down, my fingers tracing the crude markings, and I could feel a sense of unease wash over me. The symbol was unfamiliar, but it looked ancient, like something that belonged to an earlier time, perhaps to the Phelps family's forgotten past. "What do you make of this, Holmes?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes looked down at the symbol and then back at me, his eyes narrowing with recognition. "Ah, this is most interesting, Watson. This symbol is of a much older origin than the Phelps family. It is a mark that has been used in certain occult rituals, often associated with curses and death. Whoever carved this knew what it represented." I felt a chill run through me. The evidence was piling up, and it was becoming increasingly clear that the events at Blackmoor Manor were not merely a matter of a family caught in a web of superstition. Something far darker was at work here, and I could not shake the feeling that the shadow that had claimed Richard Phelps was far more than just a ghostly presence. It was a force, one that had been waiting for its time to strike. Holmes rose from his crouch and turned to me with his characteristic calmness. "The puzzle pieces are falling into place, Watson, but there is much more to learn. I suspect that our next step must be to delve deeper into the history of this symbol and the Phelps family. Only then will we be able to understand the true nature of the danger that has befallen Blackmoor Manor." I nodded, though a sense of dread settled deep within me. The mystery had grown more complex, the stakes higher. We were no longer merely dealing with a case of foul play. We were tangled in something far older and far more dangerous than we had ever imagined. And I feared that in seeking the truth, we might uncover a darkness that would be impossible to escape. As Holmes turned and made his way to the door, I followed, my thoughts consumed with the implications of what we had discovered. The curse of Blackmoor Manor was real. Of that, I was certain. But who or what was behind it? And would we be able to stop it before it claimed yet another victim? The answers, I feared, would come only too late. Chapter 5. The Shadow in the Hallway. It was late in the evening when the first report of the shadow came. Holmes and I had just returned to the manor after a long day spent questioning the few remaining staff who had not yet fled the estate. Though our inquiries had yielded little concrete evidence, there was something in the air, something thick with unspoken fears. The manor itself seemed to breathe with a life of its own, the walls heavy with untold secrets, and the corridors seemed to shift in the dim light. I could feel my nerves tightening, but it was nothing compared to the nervous agitation of our client, Edward Phelps. We were seated in the drawing room when the servant arrived, a tall man with a pale face, his eyes wide with a fear that spoke volumes. He hesitated at the door before stepping in, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as though he expected something to follow him. "Mr. Phelps," he began, his voice trembling, "there's been an incident." Phelps stood up immediately, his face already flushed with worry. "What is it, Grayson? What's happened?" "The shadow, sir," the man continued, his words coming in a rush. "I saw it again, moving through the hallway, just as before." I saw Holmes glance up sharply at the mention of the shadow. He had dismissed the idea of any supernatural involvement on our first night in the manor, attributing the strange occurrences to the psychological strain that the family had endured for years. But I could tell that the servant's terror had struck a chord with him, for he said nothing in response, only rising to his feet with a deliberate motion. "You've seen this shadow before?" Holmes asked, his voice low and steady, but with a clear edge of interest. The servant nodded, his hands shaking as he spoke. "Yes, sir. It appears at night, moving along the hallway near the old staircase. It's as if it has a mind of its own, sir. It doesn't follow the usual patterns of shadows. It seems to drift, to move as if it were alive." Holmes glanced at me, his face unreadable. "And what of the others who live here?" he asked, his voice still calm, but holding an unmistakable note of curiosity. "Have they seen this shadow as well?" The servant hesitated, clearly reluctant to speak of it. "The others, they've heard it, sir. The housemaids and the gardener. They won't talk about it openly, but it's there, and it's been growing worse. People leave the manor because of it." I could see the tension in Phelps's posture. The terror of losing his remaining staff had taken a toll on him, and now the mention of this inexplicable shadow seemed to be the final blow. He turned to Holmes, his eyes desperate. "What is it, Mr. Holmes? What does it mean? Is it truly a ghost?" Holmes stood for a moment, considering the question, before giving a slow shake of his head. "A ghost," he repeated, his tone dismissive, but not without a hint of intrigue. "Hardly. No, Watson. This is not the work of spirits or apparitions." "Then what is it?" Phelps asked, his voice faltering. Holmes turned to face him, his gaze sharp and focused. "It is far too deliberate, Mr. Phelps, far too controlled to be a simple manifestation of the supernatural. A shadow that moves with such purpose can only be the result of a physical cause. But the cause remains elusive." He glanced at me then, his eyes flicking over to where I had been standing, silently. "We will investigate this matter further, of course. But you must remain calm, Phelps. A man who is gripped by fear cannot think clearly, and this case, this mystery, requires all of your faculties." Phelps nodded, though it was clear that his nerves were far from settled. He appeared to shrink under Holmes's intense gaze, as if the very force of Holmes's presence had the power to strip away the facade of composure he had tried to maintain. "We will walk the manor tonight," Holmes continued, his voice now soft but resolute. "We shall wait and observe this shadow for ourselves." The night had fallen by the time we made our way down the long, dimly lit corridors of Blackmoor Manor. The atmosphere in the house was oppressive, and the faint creaking of the floorboards under our feet seemed to add to the growing tension. Holmes led the way, his every step measured, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the manor, ever watchful. We had decided to remain silent, allowing the house to speak for itself, as it always did in such cases. As we reached the end of the hall, the temperature seemed to drop, and an unnatural stillness settled over us. Holmes held up a hand, signaling for us to stop. There, just ahead, a faint movement caught my eye. A shadow, drifting across the hallway in the distance, gliding as though pushed by an unseen hand. My breath caught in my chest as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away from the strange, unearthly figure. The shadow was indeed unlike any I had seen before. It was not cast by any known source of light, and it did not behave as a normal shadow would. It stretched and contracted, moved sideways, and then lingered at the edge of the hall as though searching for something. I could feel my heart pound in my chest as I watched it, and I could see that Phelps, too, was trembling beside me. "What is it?" he whispered, barely able to control the fear in his voice. Holmes stepped forward, his eyes never leaving the shadow. "It is not a ghost, as I have said, but it is something more than a mere trick of the light." For several minutes, we stood in the darkened hallway, watching as the shadow moved with slow, deliberate purpose, following the contours of the walls as if it had a mind of its own. The air around us seemed to thicken with an invisible weight, and I could feel a prickling sensation along the back of my neck. Then, as if it had heard our presence, The shadow stopped, moving. It lingered there, unmoving, as though awaiting something or someone. It was then that I noticed something odd. At the base of the shadow, there was a faint but unmistakable outline, something carved into the wooden floor. Holmes knelt down, his sharp eyes gleaming with interest. "A symbol," he murmured, almost to himself, as his fingers traced the edges of the strange mark. "This is no mere shadow at all. This is part of the pattern, part of the curse." I stood frozen, watching as Holmes carefully examined the mark. His mind was already working at full speed, piecing together the puzzle, though I could not see how the shadow and this symbol were connected. What game was being played in this cursed house? As Holmes stood and motioned for us to follow, I felt a deep unease settle in my chest. The shadow had not disappeared. It had only retreated into the very fabric of the house, leaving us with more questions than answers. "It's no accident, Watson," Holmes said quietly as we began to walk back down the hall. "Whatever this force is, it is deliberate. It is orchestrating its own plan, and it is working its way towards its next step. But there is more to this shadow than meets the eye. We must uncover its true nature before it claims yet another victim." The mystery was deepening, and with it, the sense that we were standing on the precipice of something far more dangerous than we had first imagined. As the echo of our footsteps faded into the distance, I realized that whatever awaited us in Blackmoor Manor, we had already crossed a line from which there would be no turning back. Chapter 6. A Family Secret, Unveiled. The fog that clung to the streets of London had grown thicker as the days passed, but it was not the weather that weighed on my mind. The events surrounding Blackmoor Manor were becoming more complex, with each new piece of information, and I could feel the mystery tightening its grip around me, as if the very manor itself were alive with secrets it refused to reveal. Holmes, as ever, seemed unperturbed, but there was a subtle intensity to his manner that suggested he was far deeper into the case than he had let on. It was late afternoon when Holmes finally spoke of the next step in our investigation. We had been seated by the fire in Baker Street, the crackling warmth of the hearth a stark contrast to the cold that still lingered in my bones. Holmes, having just returned from a visit to a local archive, had a peculiar look about him, one I had not seen before, not in the many years I had known him. It was as though he were on the edge of something significant, something he had only just begun to understand. "Watson," he said, his voice low but firm, "I believe I have uncovered something of great importance regarding Blackmoor Manor and its original owners. The curse that has plagued the Phelps family for generations may, in fact, be more than just a tale passed down through the years." I felt a stir of unease at his words, though I kept my composure. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice betraying a hint of concern. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with the sharpness of a man who had just solved a riddle that had long eluded him. "The curse, Watson. It is not a superstition after all. It is a carefully crafted story, one that has been perpetuated over the centuries by those who sought to protect a far darker truth." He paused for a moment, as if allowing me to digest his words, but I was too eager for answers to wait. "So you believe this curse is real, that it has some basis in fact?" Holmes nodded, the faintest smile crossing his lips. "In a sense, yes, but it is not the supernatural that has haunted Blackmoor Manor. It is a far more human element, a secret buried deep within the family's history, one that has been carefully guarded for generations." I could feel my curiosity piqued, but also a growing sense of foreboding. "And what is this secret, Holmes? What have you discovered?" He sat back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of his face as he considered the best way to explain. The Phelps family, you see, did not come to Blackmoor Manor by chance. The estate was built by a man named Edward Phelps, the great-grandfather of our current client. Edward was a man with a reputation for both business acumen and, shall we say, questionable moral practices. He acquired the manor under dubious circumstances, a matter that was never discussed openly by his descendants. It was said that he had come into possession of an ancient family heirloom, an artifact of significant value, but with it came a great cost. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I listened. An heirloom? What sort of artifact? Holmes smiled slightly, as though he had been waiting for the question. It was a medallion, Watson, a family heirloom passed down through generations, said to hold some kind of power or influence. The legend, as it were, claimed that the medallion was cursed, that whoever owned it would be haunted by misfortune and death. I leaned forward, my interest piqued. And this medallion, it still exists, does it not? Holmes gave a decisive nod. It does, and I believe that it is the key to understanding the curse that has befallen the Phelps family. You see, Edward Phelps used the medallion to secure his fortune, but in doing so, he angered certain individuals, people who, in their own way, sought to punish him for his greed and ambition. These individuals, I believe, were the originators of the curse. But the curse itself is not what it seems. It is a weapon, carefully constructed to keep the Phelps family in line and to ensure that no one ever revealed the true nature of their ancestors' actions. I sat back in my chair, digesting Holmes's words. A family secret, buried for generations, tied to a cursed medallion and the sins of an ambitious ancestor. It seemed almost too fantastical to believe, yet the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The strange occurrences at Blackmoor Manor, the fear that had gripped the staff, the vague rumors of a shadow. Perhaps they were all connected to this hidden history. But if this curse is simply a ruse, I said, still struggling to fully understand, why is it still having such an effect on the family? Why is it still tormenting them? Holmes gave a soft chuckle, his eyes glinting with the thrill of discovery. Ah, that, my dear Watson, is the true crux of the matter. The curse, as it was originally conceived, may have been a tool for control, but it has become something more. Over the years, it has taken on a life of its own, a symbol of the Phelps family's guilt and the sins they continue to hide. The medallion's power, which was once a means of manipulation, has become the source of the family's downfall. They believe it is a curse, and so it remains, a self-fulfilling prophecy. I felt a sense of unease settle over me as I processed Holmes's words. The idea that the Phelps family had been so deeply affected by a fabricated curse, one that had taken root in their minds, was unsettling. But even more so was the realization that the true cause of their misfortune lay not in the supernatural, but in their own actions and the secrets they had kept hidden for so long. Holmes, I said, my voice shaking slightly with the weight of the revelation, what are we to do now? If this curse is not the cause of the deaths, then who or what is? Holmes stood and began pacing the room, his hands behind his back. The answer to that question, Watson, lies in uncovering the true story of Edward Phelps and the medallion he so foolishly prized. We must delve deeper into the history of the family, trace their connections, and find the individuals who have been pulling the strings from the shadows. Only then will we understand the full extent of the danger that lurks at Blackmoor Manor. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the mystery hanging heavily in the air. The fog outside had thickened, and the sound of distant carriage wheels echoed through the streets, as though the city itself were caught in a quiet, anxious anticipation. "One thing is certain," Holmes continued, his voice steady. "The Phelps family is not simply cursed by some ancient force, but by the consequences of their own actions. It is a family bound by guilt, and it is that guilt which drives the events we have seen unfold." As Holmes spoke, I could not help but feel the full weight of the case settle upon me. This was no longer just a matter of solving a murder or uncovering a hidden crime. It was a matter of uncovering the dark, twisted legacy of a family whose secrets had poisoned them for generations. The road ahead, I knew, would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. But I also knew that with Holmes by my side, we would uncover the truth, even if it meant confronting the very heart of Blackmoor Manor's dark history. And so, with the night drawing in and the fog thickening around us, we prepared to return to the manor where the final pieces of the puzzle awaited. What we would discover there, I could not yet say, but I feared that the truth would be far more sinister than we could have imagined. Chapter 7. The Hidden Room. The night was thick with fog as we made our way back to Blackmoor Manor. The manor loomed against the grey sky, its silhouette jagged and dark against the ever-growing mist. Holmes seemed more distant than usual, lost in thought, his mind likely already working on the next step of the puzzle we had set out to solve. I, on the other hand, found myself preoccupied with the sinister events that had unfolded over the past few days, the shadow that had moved through the manor, the cryptic messages, and the seemingly unexplainable events had begun to gnaw at my nerves. As we entered the dimly lit hall of Blackmoor Manor, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. It was an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate every inch of the estate. The manor itself felt as though it were a living, breathing entity, quietly awaiting the next misstep, the next secret to be uncovered. Holmes, ever the methodical observer, was scanning the room with his usual precision. "Watson," he said abruptly, "I believe we are overlooking something crucial here. The answer does not lie in the obvious places, nor in the whispers of the servants." He paused, his eyes narrowing. "We must look deeper, to the very heart of the manor." Without another word, he moved toward the staircase, ascending the darkened steps with a fluidity that suggested he had already mapped out the manor in his mind. I followed closely behind, my thoughts racing. What more was hidden here? What did the manor conceal beneath its veneer of grandeur and age? We reached the upper floor, and Holmes led me to a small, forgotten hallway that I had not noticed before. The walls here were lined with thick, ancient tapestries that were nearly black with dust. The floorboards creaked beneath our feet, echoing through the silence like a ghostly reminder of the manor's long history. At the far end of the hall, there was a door, small, unassuming, and seemingly out of place in the otherwise grandiose setting. Holmes moved toward the door, his hand hovering over the doorknob as he inspected it with an intensity that seemed to pierce through the thick veil of age. "This door," he muttered, "has been deliberately concealed. And yet, there are no locks, no visible sign that it is anything but an ordinary passage." He turned the handle, and the door creaked open, revealing a room so dark that at first I could see nothing at all. Holmes stepped inside. the faint sound of his footsteps muted by the thick dust that blanketed the floor. I followed, my heart pounding in my chest, unsure of what we might find. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw the outlines of shelves and old furniture, covered in layers of dust and cobwebs. But what caught my attention most of all were the objects that littered the room. Odd, foreign-looking artifacts, some broken, others still intact. They seemed out of place, almost otherworldly, as though they did not belong in this world at all. Holmes moved forward, his eyes scanning the room with keen interest. "Watson," he said, his voice low but filled with a quiet excitement, "this is no ordinary room. These artifacts—" He paused as he picked up an ancient, weathered object from a shelf. "These are relics, each one tied to a ritual, a practice far older than the Phelps family could ever have known." I stepped closer, my curiosity piqued. "Rituals? What do you mean?" Holmes turned toward me, his eyes shining with the thrill of discovery. "The Phelps family, it seems, has not only been hiding their wealth and dark secrets, they have been complicit in something far more sinister. This room," he gestured around him, "was once used for ceremonies, rituals meant to bind the family to powers beyond their understanding. The medallion, the symbol, the curse, everything we have encountered so far points to this." I felt a chill run through me as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. "You think the Phelps family has been involved in these dark rituals?" Holmes nodded, his expression grave. "Yes, the medallion was only the beginning. The true power lies in what they sought to control, the dark forces they thought they could manipulate. And it is that very pursuit of power that has brought them to ruin. What we are seeing now, Watson, is not a curse. It is the fallout from generations of dabbling in the occult. The shadows that haunt Blackmoor Manor are the remnants of the family's own greed and ambition." My mind reeled at the implications. A family bound by ancient dark practices, seeking power that should never have been theirs to command. It seemed impossible, but as I stood there, surrounded by relics and strange symbols, I began to understand. The shadow that had haunted the manor, the mysterious deaths, the lingering sense of dread, these were all tied to the Phelps family's history, to their connection with forces they could never hope to control. Holmes moved deeper into the room, his gaze fixed on a large, weathered book resting on a pedestal in the center. He picked it up carefully, the ancient pages crackling as they parted under his fingers. "This," he said quietly, "is the key. It details the rituals the family used to bind themselves to these forces. The medallion was only a token, but the rituals themselves—" He paused as he read a passage aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. "By the blood of the chosen, by the power of the Dark Ones, the soul shall be bound to the land, and the curse shall be passed down through generations until the debt is paid." The words hung in the air like a shroud, and I could feel the weight of them pressing down on me. It was not just a curse, it was a contract, a pact made by the Phelps family with forces they had no hope of controlling. And now, it seemed, the time had come for that debt to be paid. "We must stop this," I said, my voice trembling with urgency. "If the curse is real, if these rituals are still in play, we cannot let them continue." Holmes turned to face me, his expression as calm as ever, though I could see the fire of determination burning in his eyes. "Indeed, Watson, but the question is not how to stop them. It is how to sever the bond that ties the Phelps family to this dark legacy. We must find the heart of it, the place where their pact was sealed, and destroy it once and for all." I felt a rush of resolve surge through me as I understood the full scope of what we were up against. The Phelps family was not merely a victim of some inexplicable curse. They were the architects of their own misery, and it was their own blood that had bound them to this dark fate. And now, as the echoes of their actions reverberated through the halls of Blackmoor Manor, it was up to Holmes and me to undo the damage that had been done. We left the hidden room in silence, the weight of the book in Holmes's hands a constant reminder of the task ahead. The manor seemed to watch us as we made our way back through the corridors, its dark walls holding the secrets of generations. And I knew, as we prepared to confront the final pieces of this dark puzzle, that we were not just fighting for the truth, we were fighting for the very soul of Blackmoor Manor itself. The fog outside had thickened, the city of London now a mere shadow in the distance. But as I looked at Holmes, I knew one thing for certain. The shadow that had haunted Blackmoor Manor was not going to let go easily, and it was up to us to uncover the truth before it consumed everything in its path. Chapter 8. The Unlikely Suspect. The winds had begun to howl by the time we returned to Blackmoor Manor, and a heavy rain fell in sheets, casting a gloomy pall over the evening. The manor, always imposing, seemed more foreboding now, its stone walls darkened by the moisture, its windows glowing dimly with the flickering light of gas lamps. It was as if the very building had become an extension of the mystery we sought to unravel, its secrets hidden beneath layers of time, dust, and dread. Holmes had become more absorbed in the case as the days passed, and I could sense that his mind was working tirelessly, as it always did. I, on the other hand, had begun to feel a weight settling upon me, a kind of emotional burden I had not anticipated. I had seen enough death in my years as a doctor to last a lifetime, but there was something different about this case. Perhaps it was the haunted atmosphere of Blackmoor Manor, or the deep-rooted tragedy of the Phelps family, but I could not shake the feeling that we were chasing something far darker than we had first imagined. As we sat in the manor's drawing room one evening, nursing our brandy in silence, a sudden knock on the door broke the stillness. It was Mrs. Phelps, pale and anxious, her hands wringing the edges of her shawl. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling, "I beg your pardon, but there is something you must see, something that cannot wait." Holmes set down his glass and stood immediately, his expression shifting from casual relaxation to one of alertness. "What is it, Mrs. Phelps?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge of concern. She hesitated for a moment, glancing around the room as if unsure whether to speak. It is Edward. He has been acting strangely, more so than usual, and I believe he is hiding something from us. I don't know what to do." My eyes narrowed as I observed her. Edward Phelps, our client, had been the subject of much of our investigation. His nervousness and fearful demeanor were not unfamiliar to me, but Mrs. Phelps's words hinted at something deeper, something more sinister. Holmes, always quick to respond, motioned for her to lead the way. We followed her through the winding hallways, passing darkened rooms and empty corridors, until we arrived at the library, a room we had visited only briefly in the past. There, seated at the grand desk, was Edward Phelps, his face pale and drawn, his hands shaking slightly as he pored over a series of documents. Holmes approached him without hesitation. "Mr. Phelps," he said, his voice calm yet commanding, "I trust everything is well." Phelps looked up, startled, his eyes wild with panic. "Holmes, "Watson," he exclaimed, his voice cracking. I didn't mean for you to find out. I had hoped to keep it hidden." "Hidden?" Holmes repeated, his sharp gaze piercing. "What is it you've been hiding, Mr. Phelps?" The room fell silent for a moment, and I could feel the tension in the air, thick as the fog outside. Edward Phelps took a deep breath before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's my brother, my late brother, Richard. He wasn't just a victim of the curse. No, he was part of it, part of something far darker." Holmes straightened, his eyes narrowing. "Your brother was involved in this?" he asked, his voice filled with incredulity. Phelps nodded slowly, his hands trembling as he pushed a small bundle of letters across the desk toward us. Richard had been digging into the family's past. He found something, a secret that had been buried for years. He believed that the curse was not some supernatural force, but a consequence of something my grandfather had done, something that tied us all to Blackmoor Manor in a way that we could never escape. I glanced at Holmes, who was already picking up the letters and reading them with an intensity I had come to expect. "What did your brother discover?" Holmes asked, his voice taut with curiosity. Phelps hesitated, his face contorted in guilt and fear. "The medallion," he whispered. "It was never meant to be passed down through the generations. My grandfather made a pact, a deal with a group of occultists who promised him wealth and power in exchange for something far more precious: his descendants. My brother believed that the medallion was a symbol of this pact, a key to unlocking whatever it was that had bound our family to this place." Holmes stood silent for a moment, his mind working quickly. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape. Edward Phelps, clearly shaken by the weight of the family secret, seemed to carry the burden of something far beyond his control. But Holmes was not one to be deterred by mere guilt or fear. "Mr. Phelps," he said finally, "I believe your brother's suspicions may have been closer to the truth than you realize, but there is something else at play here, something that I believe you have yet to uncover." I looked from Holmes to Phelps, my heart racing with a sudden realization. "What do you mean, Holmes?" Holmes's eyes were fixed on Phelps, his expression calculating. "The motive for Richard Phelps's murder does not lie solely in the curse or the family secrets. There is someone within this very household who stands to gain from his death, a person with both the means and the motive to silence him once and for all." Phelps blinked in confusion. "But who could it be? Who in this house would want to kill Richard?" Holmes paused, his gaze piercing the room as if searching for the answers hidden within its walls. "There is one person, Mr. Phelps, who has been very careful to stay in the background, but whose actions I find increasingly suspicious. Someone who has been concealing their own motives and connections to the manor's past. Someone who may have been more involved in your family's affairs than you realize." I felt a chill run through me as Holmes spoke, the truth dawning on me with terrifying clarity. The name that came to mind was one I had not expected to consider: Dr. Lucille Hardwick, the family's longtime physician, who had always seemed so loyal, so concerned for the well-being of the Phelps family. "Dr. Hardwick?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Holmes nodded grimly. "Precisely. She has been with the Phelps family for many years, and I believe she knows far more than she has let on. Her calm demeanor, her insistence on maintaining the status quo, her quiet but unwavering support for the family, all of it points to someone who has an agenda beyond simple medical care." We moved quickly after that, with Holmes leading the way to Dr. Hardwick's quarters. The house seemed quieter than usual, the only sound the creaking of the floorboards beneath our feet. As we approached her room, I could feel the tension building, the sense that we were about to uncover something that would change everything. When we knocked, there was no answer. Holmes pushed the door open, and we stepped inside, the room dark and cold. There, sitting at her desk, was Dr. Hardwick, her hands folded neatly in front of her as she looked up with a calm expression. "I was expecting you, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice smooth and measured. Holmes did not waste time. "Dr. Hardwick, I believe you have been hiding something from us, something that ties you to the Phelps family's past and to the murder of Richard Phelps." For a moment, there was silence. Then Dr. Hardwick slowly stood, her face expressionless. "I have been waiting for you to figure it out, Holmes," she said, her voice calm, but laced with something colder. "But you must understand, the truth you seek is not one you will want to uncover." Holmes stepped forward, his eyes narrowed with intent. "What truth, Doctor?" "Hardwick, what is it that you've been hiding?" She sighed, a sound that carried with it the weight of years of secrets. "The medallion, Mr. Holmes, is not just a symbol of the pact. It is the key to a much darker legacy, a legacy that I and my family have been bound to for generations. Richard Phelps was going to expose us, and I could not allow that to happen." In that moment, everything clicked into place. Dr. Hardwick, it seemed, was no mere physician. She was the true architect of the tragedy that had befallen the Phelps family. Her own connection to the occult, to the very pact that had haunted the Phelps bloodline, was the final chilling revelation we had been seeking. The shadows in Blackmoor Manor had been waiting for this moment. And now, at last, the truth was clear. The murderer was not a ghost or a curse, but a person hiding in plain sight, manipulating the family's fate for her own dark purposes. As Dr. Hardwick stood there, her gaze unwavering, I realized that we had only just begun to understand the true depths of the mystery. The shadow that had haunted Blackmoor Manor had been human all along, and the darkness was far from over. Chapter 9. The Truth Behind the Shadow. The night was heavy with fog as Holmes and I returned to Blackmoor Manor. We had spent the better part of the day examining the site where Richard Phelps had met his end. The air was thick, the lamplights faint and flickering in the distance. There was something unnervingly oppressive about it all. The case, which had initially seemed like a twisted family tragedy, had now unraveled into something far more sinister, a clever ruse with threads that reached deep into the very heart of the Phelps family history. As we entered the manor, the same foreboding silence greeted us. The house, with its darkened halls and cold, dust-filled rooms, felt more like a tomb than a home. Mrs. Phelps had long since disappeared into her own private anguish, and Edward remained distant, a man seemingly caught between the dread of the past and the uncertainty of the future. But it was not them that I was worried about. It was the shadow, the very thing that had haunted Blackmoor Manor for generations, the thing that had been blamed for every misfortune, every death. Holmes had grown increasingly focused, and his mind, as always, was working 1,000 steps ahead of mine. I could see that something had clicked into place for him. His earlier dismissals of the supernatural had turned to a quiet contemplation, as if he were gathering the final pieces of the puzzle. We made our way to the library, where Holmes sat down with a deep sigh, looking at the fire as if it held the answers. "Watson," he said, breaking the silence at last, "I believe I have a clearer understanding of the events that have transpired here. The shadow, the curse, it is all a diversion, a well-crafted misdirection. The true culprit is not a ghost, nor an ancient family curse, but something more insidious, something human. I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. Human, I repeated. But the servants and Edward, they've all spoken of it. They believed it was real. They saw it moving through the halls. Holmes nodded. Indeed, they saw something, but what they saw was not a ghost or a spectre. It was a shadow, yes, but a shadow cast by something far more tangible, a shadow created with intent. He rose from his chair, his eyes scanning the room as if the very walls might give up some secret. It has been right before us, Watson, hiding in plain sight. The curse, the deaths, they are all part of a plan, but not the kind of plan we imagined. It is a simple murder, carefully orchestrated to appear like something far greater. I felt a cold shiver creep up my spine. Are you saying that the entire family believed in this curse, that they've been deceived by it, that someone within these walls used it as a cover? Holmes gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Exactly. And the culprit is someone no one would suspect. Someone who has been here all along, watching, waiting. The motive, however, was not some ancient feud or a desire for wealth. It was far more personal. Revenge, Watson. It was a matter of family, of old wounds festering beneath a facade of propriety. I stood, looking around the room, my mind racing. But who? Who among the manor's residents could have orchestrated such a thing? Holmes's eyes locked onto mine. Dr. Lucille Hardwick, the family's physician. The words hung in the air like a death knell. I couldn't process them at first. Dr. Hardwick, kind, professional, always calm, had been an integral part of the Phelps family for years. She had tended to their ailments, offered counsel, and had appeared to be nothing more than a dedicated servant to the family. I could scarcely believe what Holmes was suggesting. Dr. Hardwick, I repeated, my voice a mix of disbelief and confusion. But she's been so loyal, so... Holmes interrupted gently. Loyal, yes. But loyalty, Watson, is often the cover for something far more dangerous. The doctor was not just a healer. She was part of the family's inner circle. She knew their secrets, their history, perhaps even more than any of them realized, and it was her knowledge that allowed her to manipulate the situation. I could see that Holmes's mind was already running through the facts, piecing together the puzzle. But how? Why would Dr. Hardwick kill Richard? And how does the shadow fit into all of this? Holmes began to pace, his hands moving expressively as he explained his theory. The shadow, Watson, was no more than a clever trick, a ruse designed to frighten and confuse. It was nothing more than a projection, created by someone who understood how to use the shadows in the manor to their advantage. Dr. Hardwick, with her knowledge of the house's layout and the movements of its inhabitants, knew exactly how to manipulate the light and the shadows. It was an illusion, carefully crafted to frighten everyone into believing in a curse. But the true culprit, the one who stood to gain, was hiding in plain sight. I felt a rising sense of dread as I listened. The entire situation, so neatly constructed, had been nothing more than a web of lies and deceit. Dr. Hardwick, with her calm exterior and decades of service to the family, had been playing a much darker game all along. Holmes continued, his voice low and deliberate. Richard Phelps was the key. He had begun to unravel the mystery of his family's past, the connection to the medallion, the occult rituals. He had discovered enough to threaten the very foundation of the family's reputation. But more importantly, he had learned about Dr. Hardwick's true role in the family's history. She was not merely a servant, Watson. She was part of the original pact that tied the Phelps family to the ancient forces they had sought to control. And when Richard began to question those ties, when he started asking too many questions, Dr. Hardwick knew that he had to be silenced. I stood still for a moment, trying to process the enormity of it all. So, Dr. Hardwick killed Richard to protect the family's dark secret? Holmes nodded. Yes, but the murder was not as simple as that. It was made to look like part of the curse, part of the family's tragic history. The shadow, the strange occurrences, all of it was meant to mislead us, to make us believe in something supernatural. But in truth, it was a carefully orchestrated crime, executed with precision. I felt a surge of anger. And she's been walking among us all along, pretending to care for the family while hiding her own dark intentions. Holmes's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve remained unwavering. Yes, Watson, but we will confront her now, and the truth will be revealed. The shadow, the curse, all of it, will no longer cloud our judgment. The time for deception is over. With that, we made our way toward Dr. Hardwick's quarters, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of the moment, the inevitability of what we were about to face. The manor was silent around us, its secrets now ready to be uncovered. When we arrived at her door, Holmes did not hesitate. He knocked sharply, and when there was no response, he opened the door. Dr. Hardwick was there, seated at her desk, a look of calm composure on her face. But as she saw us, that calm shattered. Her eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with something that bordered on fear. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice steady, but laced with a hidden edge. "Doctor, Watson, what brings you here?" Holmes stepped forward, his voice cool but firm. "Dr. Hardwick, we know the truth. We know about the shadow, the curse, and the role you have played in this family's tragedy. It is time for you to answer for your actions." Her eyes flickered briefly, a moment of uncertainty passing over her face before she regained her composure. "You cannot prove anything," she said, her voice cold. "This is madness. The curse is real. You are chasing shadows, Mr. Holmes." Holmes's gaze never wavered. "The only shadow here, Doctor. Hardwick is the one you have cast over this family for years, and now it is time to bring it to light." As we stood there, facing the woman who had so cleverly manipulated her way through the family's darkest secrets, I knew that the truth was finally within reach. The shadow that had haunted Blackmoor Manor was no more than a deception, a lie that had been carefully crafted to protect a killer. And now, the time had come to confront that killer and to end the nightmare that had plagued the Phelps family for so long. Holmes stepped forward, his voice calm, but filled with authority. "Dr. Hardwick, you will answer for your crimes. The game is up." And with those words, the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Chapter 10. The final revelation at Blackmoor. The storm outside raged with an intensity that matched the turmoil within Blackmoor Manor. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, and the rain fell in sheets, blotting out the world beyond the manor's walls. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension, the air heavy with the weight of secrets that had been buried for far too long. I could feel it as I stood beside Holmes in the drawing room, my mind racing with the implications of everything we had discovered. "Holmes, as always, was calm, his sharp eyes scanning the room with a cool detachment that belied the urgency of the situation. He had been piecing together the final details of the case, connecting threads that had been frayed by time and deception. And now it seemed we were on the verge of uncovering the truth that had been hidden beneath the very foundation of Blackmoor Manor for generations. "Watson," Holmes said, his voice steady but carrying the unmistakable weight of anticipation. "I believe the time has come to bring this matter to a close. The mystery of Blackmoor Manor, the curse, the shadow, they are all part of a larger, far more human puzzle. And I have no doubt that we will uncover the final pieces now." I nodded, my thoughts still swirling as I tried to make sense of the complexity of the case. The Phelps family, with their long history of strange deaths, unexplained occurrences, and whispered rumors, had been the perfect subject for a mystery. And yet the truth, I realized, was far more disturbing than any curse or ghostly apparition. The murderer, as Holmes had deduced, was not some supernatural force, but someone within the house itself, a person who had been playing a careful game of manipulation, hiding behind the shadows. The shadow that had terrified the servants and left the Phelps family paralyzed by fear was nothing more than a ruse, a carefully crafted illusion designed to keep the investigation focused on the wrong culprit. And now, with the pieces finally falling into place, Holmes was ready to reveal the identity of the killer. As we made our way to the study where Edward Phelps had been found, the door opened before we had a chance to knock, and standing in the doorway was Dr. Lucille Hardwick. Her calm, composed expression remained unchanged, but there was a coldness in her eyes that sent a chill through me. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice smooth but strained. "Dr. Watson, I suppose you've come to finally confront me." Holmes regarded her with the same cool intensity. "Indeed, Dr. Hardwick. The time for deception has passed. The game is over." Dr. Hardwick stepped back, allowing us to enter. She was the one, no doubt about it. As the Phelps family's trusted physician, she had played a pivotal role in the life of the family for years. Her calm demeanor had always made her seem like a figure of reassurance, but I now understood that she had been hiding a much darker side. "Dr. Hardwick," Holmes said, his voice steady, "you have been behind the curse that has plagued Blackmoor Manor. You were the one who manipulated the family's fear, used the legend of the curse to cover up your true intentions." She smiled thinly, but there was no humor in it, only a sense of cold satisfaction. "You are clever, Mr. Holmes, but even you cannot deny that the curse has been very real for the Phelps family. They have suffered, haven't they? As they should." I felt a tightness in my chest as I realized the full extent of her words. The victim's identity, her motivations, all of it suddenly made sense. She was not a victim of the curse. She was the architect of it. She had used the family's dark history to her advantage, playing on their fears to cover her tracks. "You used the legend of the curse to hide your actions," Holmes continued, his voice firm. "The shadow that haunted the manor, the one everyone believed was a manifestation of the curse, it was nothing more than a ruse, a cleverly timed trick designed to mislead us. You orchestrated the entire thing, manipulating the family's fear to make them believe in something that wasn't real." Dr. Hardwick's eyes flickered briefly with recognition, but she did not break her composure. "It was necessary, Mr. Holmes. They had to be made to believe in it. Without the shadow, without the fear, they would have questioned everything. It was the perfect cover." I was beginning to understand, but I still could not grasp the full extent of her motives. "But why, Doctor?" "Hardwick," I asked, my voice heavy with disbelief. "Why kill Richard Phelps? What did you gain from his death?" Her smile widened, though it lacked any warmth. "You see, Mr. Watson, Richard had discovered something. He had uncovered the truth about the Phelps family's legacy, about their dark history with the medallion and the rituals my ancestors were involved in. He was going to expose us, and I couldn't allow that. Not when so much was at stake." "At stake?" Holmes repeated. "What do you mean?" Her expression turned cold. "The medallion, Mr. Holmes. It's not just a symbol of the past. It is the key to a vast fortune. My family, generations ago, made a pact to secure power, wealth, and influence that would last for centuries. It is that power I have sought to protect. Richard was a threat to that. He would have exposed everything, so I killed him. And I made sure it looked like the curse had taken him just as it had taken the others." I was struck by her words, her sense of entitlement, her belief that the lives of others were nothing more than pawns in her game for power. The Phelps family's misfortune had been orchestrated by a woman who, despite her calm exterior, had harbored a deep, calculating cruelty. Holmes, ever calm, studied her closely. And the shadow, the so-called curse, were those just distractions? Were they all designed to keep the family focused on superstition while you carried out your plan? She nodded, her eyes cold and calculating. "Precisely. The shadow was nothing but a trick, a device to keep them frightened and off balance. The curse was a story, a cover for what I had to do. And in the end, it worked. They believed in the curse so fully that they never questioned my involvement. I was their trusted physician, their friend, their confidant. And they never suspected a thing." As Holmes pieced together the final elements of the case, I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me. The entire Phelps family had been deceived by the very person they trusted most. And now, at last, the truth was laid bare. The shadow, the curse, the deaths, it had all been part of Dr. Hardwick's plan. "You have done terrible things, Doctor Hardwick," Holmes said quietly, his gaze unwavering. "But now the truth is known. The curse of Blackmoor Manor is finally laid to rest." She stood there for a moment, her eyes narrowed, as if considering her next move. But then, with a resigned sigh, she stepped back, her shoulders slumping slightly. "I knew it would come to this," she muttered, more to herself than to us. "The truth always comes out, in the end." Holmes turned to me, his face reflecting a rare moment of satisfaction. "It is over, Watson. The mystery of Blackmoor Manor has been solved. The curse was nothing but a fabrication, a well-crafted illusion designed to mask the true nature of the crimes that had been committed." I stood still for a moment, processing the enormity of it all. The story of Blackmoor Manor, once shrouded in mystery and fear, was now an open book. The shadow that had haunted the Phelps family for so long was gone, and with it, the terrible legacy that had plagued them. As we left the study, I could not help but feel a deep sense of relief. The darkness that had hung over Blackmoor Manor for so long had finally been dispelled. But even as I turned away from the case, I couldn't shake the feeling that there were still ghosts to be dealt with. The past, as Holmes often reminded me, was never truly gone. It lingered in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. But for now, at least, the curse of Blackmoor Manor was no more